and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? How can we involve more people in science? Really excited to talk to our guest today. Before I introduce our guest, I want to make sure you know who is talking on this podcast. So I am your host today, Richard Littauer. Hello, everyone. Yep, still me, calling in from New Zealand. And I'm joined today by people on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. Calling in from San Francisco, we have Juan Pablo Alperin and John Willinsky calling in from PKP, which we will get into in a second. John, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. I'm the one in San Francisco and Juan's in Vancouver. So we still have the Pacific covered well, but 3 countries with New Zealand.
Juan Pablo, how are you doing?
Yeah, doing great. Having a nice sunny day, which is a nice fall day here in Vancouver in the Pacific of Canada, as John said.
So both of you, even though you are split by 2 countries and a wonderful coastline, are involved with the Public Knowledge Project, which is otherwise known as PKP because Public Knowledge Project is just too long to say. Let's get right into it. Tell me about what it is and what it does. What's your elevator pitch?
I'll start with saying that the Public Knowledge Project is committed to open access to research, taking all of the research in the world and making it publicly available. And for 25 or so years, 1998, it began with this idea coming out of my work as a school teacher and a professor of education to see if we couldn't make knowledge public. Get it? And open source software was a key element. In 1998, open source software wasn't a thing yet. It was free software. But by the time we were releasing our first software in 2001, it had become a thing. And I was quite convinced by an undergraduate student named Kevin Jameson that open source was the best way to go. I'd never heard of it before. I had to be taught the concept. I reluctantly had to learn the lesson that you don't get to shape how open source software is used. So that was all part of my introduction to it.
So PKP is the most widely used journal publishing platform. And so journal publishing is where it spends most of its time, but you also do open source. Tell me what sort of information can go into public knowledge platform?
We do several things within the Public Knowledge Project, but the flagship of our activities are around creating this open source software called Open Journal Systems, which is, as you mentioned, is the most widely used publishing software in the world. So it's an open source solution that people can use all over the world, primarily scholars who want to publish knowledge and want to publish research. And it becomes this whole manuscript management system for receiving the manuscript, sending it out for peer review, and managing everything that happens in the workflow around the review process, around the editing, around the production process, and then eventually putting it out and being able to publish it and have it to connect to all of the other research that's out there and available for anyone to read. So by making the software freely available to everyone, having it be in the hands of the community, it's allowed people that would have not otherwise found a way or a means for actually making their research available to others to do so, lowering the cost of publishing, making sure that that research connects to everything else that's out there in the world. And so OJS, as we also know it, because Open Journal Systems is also too long to say, has grown from that thing that John was describing, was released in 2001, to this piece of software that has become an essential, what we call scholarly infrastructure. It's sort of in the backbone of what academics need to be able to do their work around the world. So 45,000 plus journals, over 1.5 million articles are published using that open source software in thousands of distributions that, in the good open source spirit, are distributed around the world. So we're not publishing them. It's the scholars and the publishers around the world that have taken up the software and are using it as the backbone of their activity.
So there are a lot of different things which have sprung up in the last 20 years in terms of ways to share knowledge publicly, right? So there's Wikipedia, there's things like GitHub, which is a proprietary platform on which you can share tons of open source code. It's probably the largest repository of that. There's things like Project Gutenberg, right, which has all these books that are available in the world, which are lovely, mostly books that are out of copyright or books which have been openly published, which I guess is a good comparison for how to think about the Public Knowledge Project and OJS. How is it any different than Project Gutenberg? How is it not just a repository for putting stuff? Why do we need to have a journal system? Can't you just put it online?
You can put journals online, but the idea of having a different kind of knowledge available to the public. So Wikipedia is an encyclopedia, and encyclopedias have been publicly available, but not freely available, not as widely available, and not with the same level of public participation. So we really admire and are inspired by the Wikipedia movement, and we started about the same time. But where we come in specifically is around peer-reviewed research, around the cutting-edge work that researchers do in all of the disciplines. I mean, think of the biomedical field and COVID research and all that, those kinds of aspects. But we also want to support history, historical studies. We want to support work in language and literature. And so we provide a platform for a very narrowly circumscribed area that hasn't been traditionally available to the public, which is research, recent research. So that aspect for us is what distinguishes us, but also makes us colleagues with these other projects, a common cause around the Internet Archive is a good example in the Gutenberg project. So it's the sharing of knowledge, and it could have been the public research that's been peer-reviewed thoroughly project, but that might be too long too. So we came with knowledge in a general sense, but we don't pretend that we're making all knowledge public. We're making one particular, very important aspect. And I would add, in the age of misinformation, bringing research into the public domain seems to us a particularly important responsibility. And we're doing everything we can to make sure that's available in a way that the public can appreciate, maybe not understand, maybe not fully comprehend every article, but can see that there's a difference, that these are sources that they have reason to trust.
So forgive me if I'm naive. Research can be a result of any sort of intensive search into a subject. Hey, I looked at this subject and it's really great. Peer review means that someone else is going after your unpublished research and checks it and say, yeah, this is kind of good. You could maybe edit it there. It could be better.
Not just someone else, though, the expertise. Right. So the editor is a researcher of the journal. So that's your first level of scrutiny. But they may be in a general area, the journal of podcasts or whatever, journal of social communication. They're a general expert. But that editor doesn't trust her or his judgment without getting the absolute expert for that article to reveal it. So it's that level of expertise and scrutiny. And Wikipedia has editors and the New York Times has editors, but this level of scrutiny is experts on experts.
I can add there to say that knowledge is out there in the world and exists, and we're creating it and transforming it in all kinds of different ways in our everyday lives and in more organized ways. But as a society, we've sort of have put the responsibility on universities and academic institutions to sort of formalize the way that we're trying to organize the construction of knowledge and build on it in a more structured way. We have used traditionally sort of books and academic peer-reviewed publications as the mechanism for trying to create some order to the way in which we organize knowledge, which is not to say that it's a better way of doing knowledge creation, or it's just a different way. And it's the way that within the academic sphere, we have chosen to try to make sense of it, to be able to circulate it amongst ourselves and amongst society in a more structured mechanism that has now become an essential piece and a cornerstone of all of the activities that happen within academia. They're part of how academic careers are structured. They're part of how the institution itself is structured, and how the disciplines are organized, and how we essentially try to carry out the work of constructing knowledge as a society in this more very particular way. And this is the place where the Public Knowledge Project is most closely trying to intervene in making sure that we do that, but we do that openly. And we do that in an aligned way with the open source movement by helping to create this open source tools that allow people to make open access to knowledge.
So I want to highlight the difference between open source and open access. So you're making these open source tools, which anyone can use and anyone can build their own journal upon and facilitate this process. But open access means that the results that come out of it have to be freely accessible to everyone. So is OJS being used by Elsevier to make journals? Is it being used by the large publishing houses, or is this something else?
No, it's not being used, but it could be, because that was one of the lessons, as I mentioned earlier, about open source. The first time it was used for a subscription journal that excluded readers, I was quite upset. And it was kind of a Khrushchev moment where you take your shoe off and bang the table. That can't happen. And that's when I was pulled aside by one of the students working on the project to say that that's not the spirit of open source software. And so we've wrestled with this question about open source software in terms of even reaching out to users. We started with a position that if you use the software, you don't need to sign up. It's open. You don't need to check in with us. You can just go and run with it and not just use it any way you want, but actually build on it and fork it into something else. And this took some getting used to for some of us who thought we would know better, and we knew better. It was a challenge for us to even know how many users we had. Juan was very instrumental in the first searches to try to determine who's using OJS. How do we know? Nobody signed up. We can't trust the downloads. That's not a predictor of how many uses there are. And we went back and forth on the best ways to determine, because we didn't have email addresses. And we had that principle. I think it's the important thing to recognize. Open source is open to use. And you give it out to the world without any questions asked. It's not like your mother. It's just a matter of go and be fruitful.
We build the software in a way that is trying to encourage that open access. We build the features to make it so that the defaults and the easiest path forward, if you've installed an instance of OJS and started to publish, is to go open access. We let the community develop those subscription modules that would lock away the research. We didn't put our own time and effort into doing that, but we did help to bring in those contributions from the community in the way that an open source project does. And so as a project, we certainly try to encourage that everything that we publish is open access. Is the motivation for why the software exists in the first place. It's how we devote and prioritize what we put our time and effort into. But as an open source project, we have accepted that there's going to be uses of the software that might not be our preferred. And that is part of what comes with doing it in this open source way.
But it was also a part of our intention to convince people. We thought, in terms of this open access to research, think about it this way. We made an open source platform as a contribution to the field. And so if we give you a publishing platform, won't you feel compelled to share your research freely? You can shake your head, yes. I was a naive beginner in this field of open source software. The joke, I think, at the time was there was wetware and software, and this was going to be retware. That is, it was rhetorical. It was trying to persuade you to make your research available. When this was developed in the early 2000s, journals were not online. Part of the first thing we had to convince them was you could trust the online medium for publishing research. And in order to do that, we thought that making this free platform would ease the path to going online. And then you would be so compelled, so overwhelmed by the generosity of free software that you would immediately make all of the research you published freely available. And that wasn't exactly how it took place, but that was the dream. And in a sense, it has. I mean, in a sense, we're open source software is supporting this massive number of journals, but I think it has to be recognized that open access is close to 50% of the research in the world that's published this year will be freely available to the public and researchers everywhere. So that's kind of a milestone in itself. I mean, the first 50% took us 20 years. I'm hoping this second 50% will go a little more quickly. But that principle of how open source software works as a motivation, as a signal, as a sign of commitment, I think has to be recognized.
I had no idea it was that high. That's amazing. I have some follow-on questions for that, but I have to ask first. You mentioned trying to figure out who your users are and how many people are there. Telemetry is impossible in open source projects. It's really hard. But often the reason why you would want to get that in the first place is figuring out, how can I get money to fund this project? So where has funding come from?
Over the years, we have relied on several different ways of trying to sustain the project. So even at the very beginning, we were very reluctant to do anything where we would charge anybody for anything that we did, but we have reluctantly taken on, and has become an important part of our sustainability, is that we provide hosting services for the software. So it's something that people can, if they would prefer for us to do the hosting, we have built up a team that can do that hosting for everyone. But we've also have, for the entire history of the project, and even at its very foundation, was on research funding and research grants. And so we have both done the software itself as a research project, as something that it's an experiment really in, can you get people to put their journals available online for free if you're giving them the tools to do so? And then we have always tried to do innovations, both in the technology and in publishing models and in other aspects that have allowed us to sort of access research funding that we can use simultaneously to build the software, as well as to understand the scholarly publishing landscape that surrounds it, which has been an important part of knowing what should we build into the software, where is the direction of the community going. We've been lucky to have some support from the Canadian government around making sure that PKP and OJS are considered to be an important part of the publishing infrastructure for Canada. And we build these things for Canada, but because it's open source, it's also simultaneously available to everyone else in the world. And then we have some members and institutions, in particular, the academic research libraries, have really seen the value in what we are doing in terms of supporting the larger ecosystem, which just helps them in terms of their acquisition budgets and the reduction of what they need to spend on those acquisitions. And also many academic university libraries are running their own publishing programs and are relying on PKP, on an OJS to do that. And so they are sort of voluntarily have become members of the project and provide those contributions. So we sort of have these different spheres. We do these services, we get research grants, we have members and partners that see it fit to contribute to the project. And between those things, we have managed to, and people always ask this question about sustainability, we don't have one mechanism that's guaranteeing the long-term sustainability of the project, but we have managed to show the value to the community that over these 25 plus years, the project has managed to continue to stay in operations and to continue to even grow over that time.
So luckily, having funding means that everything is going to be perfect and there's no competitors in the world and corporate interests will never infringe upon publishing. It's really great to see that open access is just going to continue. Obviously, that was kind of a joke because we still have these massive publishing houses that are gatekeeping science, that have massive subscription fees, which they charge libraries for to have access to journals, making research incredibly difficult, making it incredibly hard to have access to important texts, sometimes medical texts, which could potentially save lives if they were available publicly. So my question for you is, what does the last gasp of the publishing industry look like? How are they fighting back against OJS, which seems to me to be a clear competitor, right? So what are they doing?
I don't know about the last gasp, but the one before that is the publishers are saying we're open access publishers. That in fact, there has been an embrace and a recognition. And again, this almost goes back to the rhetorical point I was about the Retware, that we have in a sense won that battle. We haven't won it completely. 50% is hardly the whole of it. The publishers are still making large profits, and there are still lots of questions about the economy and equities around the distribution of knowledge. But the open access question has been a really interesting one in the sense that the major, most profitable companies now declare themselves to be heading in this direction. All too slowly in my books, but they are heading in this direction. So we have an acceptance of open access as the goal. You know, the tragic history of the pandemic has been a contributor to that because of the success in fighting the pandemic and fighting COVID that was achieved with the support of open data, open science, open access. So that part is there. The last gasp of the publishers, our world is divided in this sense. I don't think they're going to be leaving anytime soon. I think we need to find ways to work with them. The goal for us is open access. It's not the end of capitalism necessarily, at least, and the sharing of knowledge and the benefits to humankind. So part of our work has been to reach outside of the platform and to do work on copyright reform, for example, that would involve commercial publishers, giving them a path to open access. We have been trying to keep our eye on the goal, which isn't open source software, which isn't PKP and OJS, but has been this larger benefit. That is the value of research to the future of humankind. And that goal involves every kind of economic model and every kind of player. And so we try to convince and persuade. Juan's work in terms of just studying scholarly communication, trying to understand the whole of this ecosystem and the values that are at play are a part of that. So we're a software developer for a purpose. We're using open source for open access, truly. But again, both of those are being directed toward this larger goal.
You know, John and I are very aligned on almost everything, but there's areas where we do differ. And this is the desire to bring down the large publishers and have them have a last gasp is something that is still within, maybe it's because I still see it as possible within my lifetime. It might still take another many years to get there. But the challenge, I think, with the commercial publishers is that although they've embraced the open access as part of it, the model that they have chosen and the way that they've been able to do that is by using something called article processing fees or article APCs, which are our last estimate of just looking at 6 academic publishers are now, we estimate that there's over $2.5 billion, that's billion with a B, spent on article processing charges that just some of the large publishers in a single year. And I think that there creates certain inequities in the system that we still, I think, as a project need to be continuing to fight against. And it's not about so much the destruction of the publishers, but really moving them towards models that lead to more equitable access to who is able to actually make their research available. So it's not just we have to fight the battle, not just on making it free to read so that everyone has access, but also working on models that don't start charging the authors and excluding who's able to participate. The commercial publishers have demonstrated by their embrace of open access that they are very adaptable. And they've been able to see that the movement on open access, that was a battle that they resisted for many years, but have recognized that they needed to move in that direction. But they waited until they were able to find a model that allowed them to profit as much as they could. And that, I think, is something that we still will need to sort of continue to fight against as the time goes on.
Keep up the good work. One of the questions I have for you, Juan Pablo, is we're talking about building open source software and publishing OJS. Now, to me, OJS seems like a pretty coherent project. It's like, cool, we're going to build peer review and then a journal system. It seems like it's being used by tons and tons of people. Earlier, we mentioned this one word, ecosystem. And like I said, there's all sorts of similar projects, but there's also projects that align really closely with you, things like ORCID, things like Zenodo. And so I imagine a lot of the work that's going on in OJS these days on the open source front is about integrating with other open access, open scholar, open publishing type projects. Is that accurate? Is that where most of your current open source work is going? And if so, how many contributors do you have? Like, what does the day-to-day look like?
One of the things that we've always been able to do because we operate in open source is have integrations with basically everybody that's out there in the larger system. So there's some projects that, as you say, are very well aligned, trying to operate and having their data be openly available through APIs, or using standards and employing standards that allow the exchange of information, moving something from a repository into a open journal systems installation, or vice versa. Once you have something published, moving it into a repositories. All of those are things that we've been able to do with OJS through plugin architecture that's into the software. And we do continuously build new integrations as new systems come online, as new standards come to emerge. Our attention as a project is always looking to see how is it that we can best serve the evolution of publishing going forward. And so right now, there's a lot of attention going into creating more inclusive indexes that allow for the journals to be discovered and allow analysis of the larger publishing landscape. And so we've been making sure and trying to work towards sending everything that's published in OJS, even though it's being published in all of these distributed journals that spread out around the world, to be able to be gathered and having all of the metadata and all of the information about those publications available for anyone to be able to discover, access, and analyze. In terms of the number of contributors that we have to the project, we don't have really great numbers on this because we have the different project partners that are part of the development partners that are working more very closely with us. But then there's also people that are sort of developing activities and doing innovations within their own installations. Some of them are being contributed back and some of them are not. And so we could probably dig up some numbers in terms of the number of people that have written original lines of code into OJS. That's something that I don't have at my fingertips. But the size of the community in terms of both developers, editors, and other people who are giving us contributions to the project in various ways is something that is challenging for us to keep track of and something that we don't have very clear numbers on.
Richard, is there in your experience about translations? It's been a very important part of our work is to have the software translated, and our community contributes. I'm not sure about other software open source projects, whether this is a common thing. So we are running about 30 to 35 languages that are purely supported by community members translating the software. We're publishing 60 languages, which is I still find remarkable in terms of the number of languages science is being shared in. But it's one of our major areas of contributor support for the project in terms of the translation areas. And there's Open Monograph Press and there's preprint systems. It's a fair bit of translation work. And sometimes, just looking at Chinese, we're 88% of the code's been translated into Chinese, and we have a very small number of journals in China that are relying on that translation. Whereas in Indonesia, where we have 19 or close to 20,000 journals, there's very, very strong translation into Bahasa, the Indonesian language. So in your experience, has this come up in other open source interviews and discussions?
It has. Translation's really tough because you have to be large enough to have translation be a problem for it to become a problem, and then you realize how big it is. It's the kind of, Tracy Kidder, Beyond Mountains, There Are Mountains type thing, where the further you go, it's like, oh, now we have new problems. Translation is really, really tough. And it's one of the questions I kind of have for the Public Knowledge Project is where are you planning to go next? Because you can open up access to everyone in the world, but that doesn't mean everyone has the amount of understanding and able to use that access in order to facilitate actually working that into their workflows, working it into their doctor's practice, their research practice, et cetera. And language is one of the biggest barriers to that. Do you have a more specific question around where translation is relevant? Because for me, like that's something I struggle with a lot. But I don't have an exact answer except that, yes, it's hard for everyone.
What I'm saying actually is the community. I want to commend the community. It's one where we didn't develop it, where this just started. In fact, we paid for French. I think we paid like for one or two at the very beginning. And then we had a trouble between Quebecois and Parisian French. And then it just took off. So it's just a very interesting aspect for me. Whereas the code, I think, Juan, at some point we were giving code contributions credits within the code itself, and it just was impossible to track after a while. We have hundreds of plugins and different ways in which people contribute. So that the crediting is a tricky part. We use WebLate for translation, which manages and does credit and allows us to kind of keep track. So there are tools, open source tools to support open source software development. We use Mattermost instead of Slack, for example. So we try to build that ecosystem of open source. We still slip into Google Docs, and I got a Microsoft Word doc the other day, cheapers. So there are those aspects that we're still moving and growing in terms of your question about what about the future and how is this continuing to evolve.
I was just going to say that there was 2 projects there to consider for the spotlighting at the end already. I think of both WebLate and Mattermost are 2 things that we use a lot, but we can hold off on that until the end. But just these things are already coming up because they're part of our daily work. On this notion of translations, I say that we probably pretty lucky in that sense in terms of have developed a very large translator community. Maybe it's the nature of the work of working in this scholarly space where the community is very much global, and the people that are interested in making their knowledge available to others are coming in large part from parts of the world that haven't been traditionally represented by those large commercial publishers. So our user community tends to be largely in the global south and operating, as John said, and publishing things in over 60 languages as far as we can tell. And I think that global community that has sort of hungry for making their research and their knowledge available to others is highly motivated to make sure that the platform that they're using to do that is available to their authors in their local languages. And so that has created a natural community that has gravitated towards translating, and the importance that people place on having appropriate translation. So we see multiple versions of French, multiple versions of Spanish. We see the multiple versions of Portuguese as people have these differences that even though the language they could understand, but they want things written with their version of the language.
Looking forward, looking to the future in terms of the integration with other open source software is the whole question of AI, large language models. We've been working with Mixtral, with open source large language models as an example of that, trying to see ways in which that could serve the very specific needs that we have, that we think may be a potential application. This could involve copy editing. It could involve picking up the metadata within articles. Big challenge has been, it's getting a little technical, but getting into the markup languages used for articles. XML is pretty commonly known, but we have a very specialized form of XML extensible to scholarship called JATS, which is a tagging system. Our hope is to use open source tools to increase the access of the publishing opportunities. And one of the big divisions between what are called diamond journals, one of the big divisions between journals that don't charge authors and don't charge readers and the commercial system is the way articles are marked up, the way that the commercial system can afford to do HTML, it can do JATS, XML JATS. And so one of our areas of exploration, and certainly not ready for market or ready for widespread use yet, but is the exploration of open source large language models as a way of training and automating the markup so that all the journals in the world can be in XML, which means they can export easily to areas like PubMed Central and other kinds of indexes, but also can be more readable online in terms of HTML as well as PDFs. I'd like to say we had something ready and to roll in that regard, but as Juan mentioned, we don't always see eye to eye on every aspect. And there's a bit of controversy. I think it's wise to acknowledge AI and the large language model It's growing at such a pace too, so it's hard to keep up. And again, this is part of our responsibility as an open source software developer. We're part of that test bed, part of exploring what can be done to see the advantage in these tools. And what I appreciate is my colleagues in the project bring to the skepticism and the questions and the costs and the footprint even of large language models in terms of the grid, the electricity they're using. So all of these things are part of what makes our work interesting, challenging, and slow, a test of patience.
It's cool to hear about it, and it makes sense to me to automate some of that work. The way we do it is going to be very, very tough. So translating into a language is relatively straightforward if you have two speakers who are bilingual and you can figure that out. What's really difficult is translating into customs and translating into the values which are encoded within the language and within the community that speaks those languages. So for instance, here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, there's the Maori culture, which never ceded the land, which works with the government in some capacity. And they have their own system of morals and etiquette called tikanga, which is relevant to how they see the world. And peer review is a very Western Eurocentric view of experts reviewing experts and then publishing. And then this is a formalized thing that's been accredited versus, say, other ways of doing science or doing customary research, which could be more inclusive. Another good example might be open access. A lot of indigenous tribes in Turtle Island or North America don't like open access for their cultural work because the cultural work is somehow owned by the community as opposed to being owned by humanity as a whole. The community has the right to that work, and sharing it beyond is not ideal. And so I'm curious if you've run across any of these issues with dealing with smaller communities, and if you've had any thought around how to translate well between communities of practice and communities of praxis and so forth.
We have worked with indigenous communities around protocols of knowledge. So this has been part of our learning as well. We started with the notion that we're not just knowledge in general. And I think Juan very nicely encapsulated that principle, that this is just one aspect. And I think New Zealand should be proud of having a Maori university or two in terms of that engagement with these standards. So on the one hand, we're saying we're not trying to reach every community, every cultural standard. We're bringing a particular aspect. On the other hand, we have sat down with indigenous groups, particularly in Canada, to talk about how we can align, how we can provide a space for this kind of work. We're just doing the Canadian Journal of Native Education, for example. I've been working with the editors there, Dustin Louis, and I think we're arriving at a point of a statement, of giving authors a chance to take a stand on their regard and relationship to academic knowledge as part of the engagement with that. So we're learning from this experience. We're trying to see that this is a particular kind of knowledge, and that there's a kind of tension there too, right? There's upholding the standards, respecting people's aspirations in terms of their careers, and acknowledging that the values on this planet are changing, and rightly so. So that's, again, where we come in. This may not be a coding question so much of the open source software sensibility, but what open source software has represented is a kind of thinking about software as a medium, as an point of exchange, as a relationship determiner, and an economic model. And I think that influence of open source as sharing is already cultural. And how we make that more inclusive culturally is part of what we're sitting down and listening. And, it does come down to where does this position statement of the author go and that kind of, more technical aspect. But that's part of what's exciting about this work.
I think I'd also like to add that within the confines of what it is, this model of a journal as being this particular form of how we communicate knowledge, that one of the things that has been a principle of PKP has always been about making sure that the software could be taken and hosted locally and that communities could take up the software and use it however they saw fit. So we talked about that a little bit at the beginning of this conversation. But there's an important element here that we are building the software and trying to incorporate ways of including different models that how it could be used, but we are giving it to anyone that wants to take it up, that wants to pursue sort of making their knowledge public in these particular academic form, and to adapt it or at least use it within whatever are the rules of their community. And we see different people following different workflows and who are they involving in the process of publishing their content. We see it in how it's institutionalized, how the journals are sort of funded, and the kinds of policies that the editors might put in place around what kinds of work they'll accept, what formats and so on. So there is some amount of trying to ensure that we are not prescribing what the workflows entirely need to look like. We're not prescribing what the policies need to be that these journals are publishing. And we're not prescribing what content should be made public using the software. So we are trying to at least attend to these sensibilities within the confines of what a peer-reviewed journal publication as a particular sort of Western form of knowledge construction prescribes.
Longtime listeners will know that I often have a problem with people whose projects are just too good, where like it's really clear what they're doing and they have a funding model in place. And it's just like, yeah, cool. I don't really have any questions. It sounds like you're doing the right thing. Good job. Keep it up. So that's kind of how I feel right here. This is amazing. And I have a lot more that I'd like to get down into the weeds about, but we just don't have the time in an hour-long podcast, which is really, really sad. Even shorter if you're getting the edited live version. Hello, listeners. It's good to hear from you. So with that in mind, I guess I have one final question before we wrap up and go to Spotlight, which is what's really hard right now? Like what's really difficult at PKP or OJS in terms of sustainability and keeping the work going or what you're facing? Because so far you've answered most of the questions like a breeze. And so I just want to know what's keeping you up at night, if anything.
I think as a project, even though we are in a very good moment, it has not always been this way. We have gone through times when it looked like the number of the resources, the people we could put on it was quite stretched and limited. We're in a particular good moment, so you've caught us at a particularly good time, but I'm not resting easy at thinking that this is how it's going to be going forward. Our team is still always very stretched. There is so much, as the community of users has grown, so have the demands, the expectations that people have of the project. I think that the community as a whole doesn't have a sense of how small our team is and how much we're always sort of hustling to make sure that we have the resources available to attend to their needs. And so while we're in a particularly good moment right now where things looks like we're able to take a bit of a breath, I'm still concerned about this long-term sustainability of the project and making sure that we can continue to attend to the growing needs and to attend to the diversity of the publishing activities that people are wanting to use with our software in a way that is able to allow the project to continue to fulfill its overall mission of supporting public knowledge while not having everyone that's working on the team end up being burnt out and strained and pulled apart and driven away from being able to contribute to this project.
I'd add to that just the responsibility we have. We've created this community of publications of 1.5 million articles a year, and they have yet to be fully indexed. There is a sense of potential here that is not being fully utilized. So what I think is our challenge now is to see how we can ensure that those publications are recognized, are integrated into the whole of the research exchange, and people take advantage, humankind benefits from the results of the wholeness of the integrity of the entire research project. That's not the case. The area in which we work in the Global South has grown so quickly. The number of institutions has increased over the last 20 years to a point where the number of journals is just catching up. The 45,000 journals that we're talking about are part of a new growth of higher education and research production. The Global North has been slow to recognize that. There are traditional colonial prejudices at play around the center and the periphery, which you know very well. So that part of it is something that is a challenge and that is not our success story yet. We are producing this much research, but is it being fully integrated and the sharing of knowledge? And this is not just on us. This is on the global indexes and on the global community recognizing that there's a great amount of research that's now available. And we're helping make it clear that it is peer reviewed and it has integrity, but we need some recognition that there's a value here and that research needs to be seen on a global scale and not simply the comfort zone of the global North.
I love that answer. I went down a rabbit hole recently with scientific names and binomials and realized that there is kind of, the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, which sort of deals with that work, but also not every answer is fixed. And it turns out there is no global index of all scientific names. There are no parents running the show. And at some point I realized, oh no, it's kind of up to us to fix all these problems. And that's kind of the same thing I'm hearing from you is that, yeah, we need to index all these things. We need to make it publicly available. We need to make it shareable. And that's a lot of work, and it's work that's to be done. So good luck. That sounds awesome. If I wanted to help and if listeners wanted to help, where can they find these projects online?
You can find the project at pkp.sfu.ca. SFU is for Simon Fraser University because we have our institutional home here in Vancouver, Canada, where I'm based. And there's a sort of set of links there that they can find to look at where's places to find the community. There's a forum where they can look at the questions that people are asking. And if those that are willing to ask or answer questions or contributions there in terms of helping to support these thousands of journals, because we cannot keep up with the number of questions that come in. You can also find ways of doing translations. That's something that people don't necessarily need to have the expertise. And so you'll find links there again in the community involvement to look at our translation platforms and get signed up as a translator and a place of contributing from small single phrases or word translations to taking on the whole software and bringing it to the language that you speak and the language that you're fluent in. So we would very much welcome the community's involvement in those areas.
Also, you can probably reach out to Juan Pablo Alperin or John Willinsky on those sites. And if you can't, they may be in the show notes. And if you can't, email me and I will send it on to them. They are available. Sorry about that, both of you. Hopefully you get inundated by awesome requests for help. Don't leave yet, however. Don't run in fear. Now it's Spotlight. It's part of the show where we highlight other projects, people, or things that we particularly love or that we think are excellent and just need some light put on them. My spotlight today is Coahuila-Chicomoch, Quebec, which I realize I've never spotlighted before because it's a community and not a person. But Coahuila-Chicomoch is a small town, basically, for some Naskapi people. There's 641 residents, according to Wikipedia. And it's where I went and where I talked to some linguists who work for the Summer Institute of Linguistics, who are missionaries there translating Naskapi and English together, which is how I was able to write my master's thesis on Indigenous languages. And I realized that I'm just really grateful to the people of Coahuila-Chicomoch for taking this random stranger who just showed up on the train one day and says, I like languages, anyone want to talk to me, and then listened. So thank you so much. And if you ever get the chance, there's a 300-mile train that's not connected to any other trains, and it's a really just interesting ride. Highly suggest checking out Northern Quebec if you have the time. Juan Pablo, what is your spotlight today?
I wanted to spotlight Pandas, which I realize is a project that most people that are doing things with Python are already aware of. But when I discovered Pandas during my PhD, it was a transformative moment in being able to do sort of data analysis in a completely different way in a language that I could operate and work in Python. My research is quantitative. I'm grabbing large amounts of bibliographic data and trying to analyze it. And Pandas just sort of has made that a breeze. So a shout out to Pandas as a thank you. It's, again, a project that most of the Python community is already aware of, but one that I cannot live without.
Spelled like pandas. And John, what's your spotlight?
I would go back to Mattermost and say that the way in which the community can connect so thoroughly and be present with each other on so many different time zones to share documents and materials, it is a replacement or it is a substitute for commercial versions of communication, but it does provide a sense of being part of an open source community, and we were immensely grateful. It's always so hard to change platforms and to learn a new system and have that steep curve, but Mattermost made it easier and in some ways convinced us that we were making great gains, not just substituting commercial for open, but actually getting a better experience for building community.
Awesome. Listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. If you have, there's a few things you can do. One, you can go to PKP and just go collaborate and join, help translate, have a good time, or ask about their funding models and sustainability models and see if you have any suggestions. Two, you can like this podcast and talk about it, which is kind of similar, but somewhat unrelated. Three, you can email me at richard@sustainoss.org or podcast@sustainoss.org if you want to go to the other hosts as well. You can suggest other guests. You can give me critique, criticism, thanks, love notes, whatever you like. That'd be really nice. And of course, if you really want to donate back, that'd be really awesome. opencollective.com/sustainoss is where you can donate to this podcast, which is not free. That would be really, really great. Like this wherever you are listening to it. Follow us on the discourse, on the Mastodon, LinkedIn, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And check out these show notes at podcast@sustainoss.org, where you can find more about some of the links and quotes we had today. John, Juan Pablo, thank you so much for joining us today. I think this was really an awesome episode. I'm really sorry that it was only an hour long. Hopefully next time we can do a 2 or 3 day thing where we can just talk for the entire time and then people will listen to it because that's what people have. But this was great. Good luck. And thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Richard. It's been a pleasure. Nice to have
Thanks for having us.
Chat.